This is North Pod, a North Melbourne fan podcast, hosted by Jason Hunt.
Stevenson with his own moves. Carrington. North are in front.
Hello, welcome back to yet another episode of North Pod, everyone's favourite, I don't know if it's your favourite, everyone's North Melbourne podcast. We are deep in the off-season, the post-season now. It's preliminary finals week, so anyone that's been following North Melbourne recently would know that that's not a time of the year that we have been playing recently, and therefore we're talking about other things. This episode, we're going to be solely or almost completely focused on the defence, and we're going to have a look at a bit of a season review for each of the players that played in defence for this year. More or less all the players. Obviously, there are players that play in more than one spot on the ground, and what I've done is split the players up into 3 lots of 15. We had 45 active players on our list this year. Taron Thomas, I think it's fair to say, doesn't count. So if we take him away, we had 45. And so I've got the 15 players that I think were, more or less defenders for this year. Toby Pink is one that definitely could have been in here, but I've put him in the forward line just for numbers' sake because he was kind of a 50-50 split. And Bailey Scott did spend a fair amount of time in defence, but I would like him to be a winger, so I've put him in with the midfielders. The only thing that I did want to touch on before we jumped into reviewing each of those defenders' seasons is, I guess, the scuttlebutt and the talk from the industry types is that Jack Darling coming to North is, as good as done in terms of him wanting to come and us presenting him with a contract. He still does have a 1-year deal with the Eagles, so we're going to need to sort something out. I certainly hope that we're not giving up too much trade value, so to speak. I hope that's a pretty easy deal to sort out. It sounds as though it's going to be a 2-year deal. Yeah, look, I think holistically it's positive. I'm not looking at that and thinking it's a game-changing move. I'm not looking at that and thinking, well, that's going to save our season and, get us from 17th to 8th. But I do think some extra help for Larky, in terms of a senior body, someone who knows how to play footy is going to be helpful. Now, what his quality of football next year looks like, I don't know. He played some good games this year, but certainly was not, in career best form, which is totally understandable at his age. I think he might be 33, turning 34 soonish. So, you're not going to get the highest quality of football out of him at that age. But is it going to be an upgrade on someone like Toby Pink, someone like Brent Eagle, potentially? And there's no doubt that, whilst potentially I don't really align with his stance on vaccination, I think he's a pretty smart footballer. So you wouldn't want to be bringing in 5 players in his age bracket. I think 1 or 2 is the perfect amount, and ideally in different areas of the ground. We know we're also potentially in the market for Luke Parker, which is in the midfield area of the ground, but also can play forward. I certainly hope, and it seems as though we've decided or we've picked Jack Darling over Tim Membry, and therefore we're not going to pursue Tim Membry, which, if I was picking, I could see both sides. Membry's a bit younger, but hasn't necessarily played in those super successful sides recently, so look your way up which of those you want more. I think Jack Darling, so long as we can get him across and give up very little draft capital, I think I'm okay with it. I just don't think it moves the needle dramatically. I don't think we need to be, celebrating. There'd be people out there that are thinking, well, Jack Darling's past it, why bother? And, I think there's some total validity to that. I guess I would just ask you to reflect on, who we've been playing as our second and third tall this year and whether or not Jack Darling is a downgrade, a move sideways, or an upgrade. And I tend to think he's probably, at worst, he's a move sideways, because I don't think Toby Pink or Brent Eagle are likely to be in our long-term plans. You never know. Maybe one of them makes it and sticks around for 5 or 6 years and, is a good depth player or a good sort of 22nd, 23rd best player on the list. But they're certainly not the sorts of players that you're going to build your list around. And we're not really in the business right now of, saying no to quality AFL players. I think we're going to take them where we can, still focus on on our core young group, but you can't sit still. And if we can upgrade our list slightly, I think it's worthwhile. It's a different story if Jack Darling's coming in and taking time away from a 22, 23-year-old young key forward. But it just that player doesn't exist on our list. And even if it did, we've only got Nick Larkey in there as a key forward, as a young, promising or experienced player either way. He's not going to take minutes away. So look, we obviously wait to see what happens with that deal. If it does eventuate, there's still some things to transpire, but it looks as though it's heading in the right direction. And I think we should be, quietly optimistic about it. Like I said, so long as it's not a massive draft capital that we have to give up. So with that kind of news, so to speak, out of the way, let's jump into the player review. I did a very similar thing last year. I'm going to try and set it up in a similar way. I'm going to score each player out of 10. I will aim to be as objective as possible, but obviously it's my opinion, so there's going to be some subjectivity to it. But I'm trying to essentially not look at expectation at all. It's just from 0 to 10, what was that player's impact on the field this year? So 10 would be an exceptional, near-perfect season or perfect season. 5 is that player had a bang average year for an AFL footballer. And 0 would be absolutely horrible year or didn't play for whatever reason, like that kind of thing. So obviously there's going to be some shades in there. I'm trying to look at it without taking into account expectation, age of player. And so as I go through it, I've kind of, I've got some thoughts around some players are going to score a little bit lower, but it's kind of an optimistic low score because we don't have high expectations for them yet. So it's okay. They're at that point. That's my thinking. I don't think there is a perfect way to, score players because when you're trying to factor in expectation, I think you end up with some really, strange looking scores. So my thinking is 10 is virtually a perfect season. 0 is zero impact or an awful season. 5 is you're an AFL player and you're average. And I want to say average in that it's not average. I feel like, in today's nomenclature, you can kind of average is a bit of a put down. I'm saying average is what it is. It's a middle ground. It's you were fine. You did your job, more or less. So yeah, that's what we're going to go for. We're just going to go through, like I said, those 15 defensive players. And then, we're going to try and talk our way through it. So we're just going in jumper number order, which means that Aidan Corr is first up. He played 23 games, averaged 12.5 disposals a game, 5.2 spoils per game. And I thought most weeks, given he was taking the most dangerous tall forward, generally speaking, for the opposition, I thought he did a pretty good job. Had some standout games. We all remember that game against Max King where he just blanketed him, played a really, really good game on Kyle Langford. And, I think given the amount of ball that was coming in, the amount of inside 50s that we were conceding, I thought he did, a better than average job. Still prone to the old brain fade from time to time, can make a clanger. And I think part of that is the amount of pressure that he's often under because of the amount of ball coming in. So, I take that into consideration. He's got certainly a lot more opportunities for clangers than your average key defender. Yeah, and I think probably started the season a little slowly, but grew into it. And by the end, I think was really consistent. His finish in the Sid Barker reflected more or less that he had a pretty good year. Last year, I scored him a 6, and I think he was a touch more consistent this year, in particular the second part of the year. I think, like I mentioned, a bit of a slow start, but there was certainly no one calling for his head by the end of the year. He really cemented himself as someone who can take on those big keys if required, and with Griffin Logue out of the side, he was required to do that. On the back of that, I think I have to give him a 7 out of 10. Certainly an above average year. Did nothing to push the needle to be that 8, 9, 10 where you go, what a ripper season. But I think he had a good year based on the amount of ball that was coming in. So I think I had to score him a 7. And I think that's pretty fair based on the body of work across the year. Played every game and, didn't look like getting dropped at any point. It was a positive contributor in a lot of games. Colby McKercher, 16 games, averaged 23.8 disposals per game, 415 metres gained, 5 rebound 50s per game, nearly 3 running bounces per game. We know that he was filling the stat sheet, was interrupted a little bit with injury, which is why he only played the 16 games. That was certainly not due to a lack of form that he was missing. Provided a lot of run-off halfback, accumulated disposals of fun, and more or less replaced that Sheasel role from last year. We know that Sheas still started the year off halfback and then transitioned into that more midfield forward half type player. I think that, McKercher plays it in a slightly different way to Sheas, certainly a much more uncontested game. Sheasel was still doing a lot of contested work off halfback last year, as well as his uncontested stuff, and did rack up a little bit more of it. They played a similar role, but certainly I would say played a different way. Had some standout games, Colby, 37 disposals twice, once in the Gold Coast win and once in that second West Coast loss. I think we saw little spurts of, what it could look like for him as a midfielder in the future, and a really, really super promising first season. I think we all know we've got a player, we know long-term we want him to be in the midfield, but he can absolutely play in the back half, all of this year, and I'd be tempted, if possible, to keep him there for another year or two because, why rush? I think he can play some fantastic footy at halfback. Potentially also develop some defensive craft. You still want his main focus to be rebounding, but if you can add some defensive positioning and, just a bit of craft around how to play on a player, I think that can only help you when you move into a full-time midfield role. And I mean, look, it's going to sound a bit boring, but I think it's the same for him. It's a 7. He probably played a touch more consistently than Core, but wasn't able to stay on the park for, a couple of different reasons, had some injuries, and was probably a little bit, I think his highs were higher than Core is what I would say, but his lows weren't as low. So look, on balance, I think a 7 is fair. If you're going based on what, the fact that he's a first year player, you'd be scoring him higher, but I think his output was a 7. He had a good year for an AFL footballer, which is, remarkable considering it's his first year. That being said, he's a high draft pick, so you do want to get some good footy out of him. So I think a 7 for Colby as well. Luke McDonald is an interesting one. So 22 games, just missed the first game of the year, 14 disposals per game, 4.8 marks, 2.3 tackles. Now, obviously, with these defenders that are more defensive types, the stats don't necessarily tell the whole story. I do think it's worth noting that's his second lowest disposal average in his career, is 14. So he did accumulate less of the footy, was doing less of that rebounding, and was trying to play, for the most part, a lockdown role. And to be honest, a big part of his role is communicating and making sure the rest of the defence knows where they're supposed to be. When you go to games, you watch him making sure, I think we should swap now. You've got some time to get back and swap with that player. He does a lot of talk on the field, which, people will criticise because anyone can do that. But you do need someone down the defensive half making sure that that's under control, and typically that would be a leader. So I think it is an important job, and I think he did a serviceable job of that. 1.7 clangers per game, which is down on his career average. I thought was, making less of the mistakes that we saw last year that made him a bit of a whipping boy. There was certainly some holdover whipping boy tendencies from the fan base, because a lot of what Luke McDonald does is not necessarily stuff that's going to get you excited as a fan. But I do think that he played a better version of his role this year, was taking less risks, and part of that is why he had less impact, because he wasn't biting off kicks that he shouldn't be most of the time. He wasn't making those mistakes that we've seen him make last year when he's tried to do a little bit too much and go outside of his capabilities. The other part, I suppose, of that is he's got less clangers because he was getting less of the ball. So, you can take that all on balance. I thought he had a consistent but unremarkable year. And so this is where I think he's right on a 5. He had an average year. He had an average AFL footballer year. It's not one that he's going to look back on and go, gee, what a year I had. It's not an awful year. It's a 5. So I think Luke McDonald a 5, and that kind of gives you a benchmark for what's going to be above or below average, because McDonald just sat right in that middle where there weren't many games where I was frustrated with him, but by the same token, there weren't many games where I was impressed with him. He was there filling, for the most part, his role. So Luke McDonald 5. We move on to Darcy Tucker, and he was a tricky one, a really tricky one. 23 games, so played every game, 17.4 disposals per game, 4.4 marks, 2.5 tackles, 3.1 rebounds, 50s, and 3 out of 4 of those were career high. Career high disposals, career high marks, career high rebound 50s, which, makes sense because he was playing a predominantly back half role. But I do think it's worth noting that he had career highs. He came across nearly 2 years ago, in fact, with Griffin Logue. And I think we had a bit of an expectation that he was going to come in and, rejuvenate a certain area of the ground. Turns out he's just a great gap filler, and I think you need those role players in the side, but he's not necessarily going to excite you with what he does. He did have a couple of high possession games, 29 possessions versus Port, 30 touches against the Dogs. Just missed out on the North Podium votes a couple of times this year. We saw him completely shut down Dylan Moore for 3 quarters in the last round of the year, and then unfortunately get torched in the last quarter. But I think in general, he lowered the gap between his best and his worst this year. Last year, there were times, he was in and out a little bit. He didn't start the year due to injury, and then he wasn't necessarily able to completely find that role to play. But we saw when he was mostly playing at halfback, and then every now and then he'd kind of rotate onto a wing and fill a gap where need be. I thought he was able to actually play that role with consistency. And similar to Luke McDonald, you don't want the footy in his hand doing dangerous stuff. I don't mind him hand passing it or punting it down the line, but he doesn't really have a dangerous kick in him, so he just needs to stay in his lane. And I thought he did that for the most part this year. A 4 last year, and so I think he had a better year than last year. I just don't know if I could justify quite getting him to that 6. I don't know if we could say that he had an above average season for an AFL footballer. I thought similarly he was bang on average. There weren't too many games where I was upset. There weren't too many games where I was like, gee, Darcy Tucker was good. He just played his role. And, we know what it's like playing in that back line at the moment. It's tough going. And if you're not being shown up time and time again, for the most part, you're doing your job. So I think a 5 for Tucker. And so you kind of see where that benchmarking is at. Luke McDonald 5, Darcy Tucker 5. They played all year. And for the most part, they weren't in conversations to be dropped. No doubt there were fans that did want both of those players dropped, but they didn't tend to be those ones where the fans were really calling out for them to go back to the VFL. So a 5 for Darcy Tucker, an average year for him, and an improvement on last year. So I think we'll take that, and we need players in his age profile playing well. Zach Fisher is an interesting one. 18 games. 24 disposals per game, 5 marks, 0.9 of a tackle, 400 metres gained, 5.8 rebound 50s, 3 clangers a game. So similar to McKercher, filled the stats sheet, but I don't think was anywhere near as effective as McKercher with the ball. At times he found more of it, had games, disposals in the middle part of the year. He had 30, 34, 31, 32, 36 consecutively. And I think at that point there was a lot of excitement around how much ball he's getting. And no question he tried his guts out, but I just don't know that he was able to be as damaging or hit as many targets. Often he was kind of making it up, and sometimes when the player's making up, you go, "Oh, I trust him. It looks a bit dodgy, but I think they'll figure it out." With Zachy Fisher, he often, I found, didn't figure it out and was bombing it long to get out of trouble because he kind of created that trouble for himself. Now, I think he's playing a really hard role because he's trying to be a creator. He's trying to make stuff happen when the opposition is absolutely shutting you down in their attacking 50. So it's a hard role. But I think if we compare the season that Fisher had with McKercher, there's no doubt in my mind that he wasn't as effective at doing that job. It's hard to separate reality from expectation, but I think we had higher expectations than this for a player coming in. Couldn't get a game at Carlton, albeit, he actually could get a game, but he wasn't getting a game all the time, was dropped for finals last year. So he's right on the fringe for Carlton. He should therefore walk straight into our side without an issue. But I think at times there were issues with his ability to defend. And, his Sid Barker placement reflected that, I think. Like North Podium only scored a vote, and in the Sid Barker, he was well back for a player that I think of his age profile probably should have been doing better. So I think a 4 for Zach Fisher. He had just below an average year for me. I know there'll be people that that disagree with that, and that's fine. Like, feel free to comment and let me know your thoughts on Zachy Fisher. It's not a hangable offence by any stretch. I'm not suggesting that we've completely blown our money or anything like that. I just think I'd like to see a little bit more from him. I wonder next year if swapping him forward might be the way to go. I know we brought him in to play off half-back. I totally get that, but we know that a small forward is something that we're crying out for. It's a role that he has played. My issue is around his defensive capabilities, and that's an issue at either end of the ground, because you want that pressure if you're playing in the forward line, and you want the ability to actually defend when required if you're playing in defence. And I think that was something that he found really challenging to do, based on just his height and his strength. He doesn't have a lot of either of those, and was often easily pushed out of contests, or not going for a mark because he knows that he's just going to hurt himself. So it was, it's kind of smart of him, but you can't be a complete liability in defence. You need to have some capability down there, I think. And where I think Colby McKercher can grow into that, I just don't know if Fisher can, based on where he's at with his career. So a 4 for Zachy Fisher. I would be in favour of experimenting with him forward next year personally, but I understand if we don't, because you've got to have those creators off half-back, and I think he can do that well at times, but I would like to see him do that a little bit better, or with a little bit more consistency. Then we go into a couple of players or several in fact, that weren't able to get on the park too much, so they're going to score much more low as a result of that. We'll start with Riley Hardiman. 3 games, subbed out in one of them, 10 disposals per game. Looked like a player in that short time. Like, we know that you're not going to expect much from him in his first year. He was drafted in the 20s, so he's not going to be an absolute gun that comes straight in and dominates. He didn't do that, but I thought had plenty of great VFL form. Looks like he's going to be a player of the future. And, as a defender, the stats don't tell the whole story. So 10 disposals per game doesn't get you excited, but, we've seen what Jackson Archer's been able to do coming in from the VFL with similar stat lines that don't impress you, but then they come up to AFL and, either they make it or they don't. So I think given he played a lot of VFL footy and he was, serviceable at AFL level, and looks like he could be a player that, could replace a Darcy Tucker or a Luke McDonald in the short to medium term. I think a 3, not a lot of impact at AFL level, but we also weren't expecting much from him. He played plenty of footy at VFL level and looks like, he didn't put a foot wrong when he was in the side. I think he was probably a little unlucky not to get a couple more games. So I think a 3 for Riley Hardiman is where he's at. I could be argued into a 2, but I'm going to go with a 3. Will Dawson, very similar. 3 games, subbed out in his last game without registering a stat because he injured himself in the first quarter. So 8 disposals per game in the 2 games that he actually finished, 3.5 marks. I wasn't expecting him to play at all this year, to be honest, and I mean, he nearly didn't. So, take that on. But 200 centimetres, you'd expect him to take a bit more time and develop his game in the VFL. We saw him being experimented with at the VFL level. Played forward a little bit in the ruck. I certainly hope that we sort of settle on where we'd like to play him and we try and develop in that area. He was drafted as a defender. If we want to swing him forward, I think it's important that we make that decision early so we give him time to practice that role. Anyway, we'll see what happens next year, but I think at this stage I'm saying he's a defender, even though that West Coast game that he got injured, he came in to play as a forward, and then we saw a bit of that in the VFL when he came back from injury. He was led to the footy a lot in his 2 AFL games in defence, but I think for him it's just about understanding the level. Similar to Hardiman, it's not a knock, but we just need him to bide his time. So I think he probably was a little worse than Hardiman when he came in. So I think I've sat on a 2 with him, but this is where it's like the 2 doesn't mean it was a bad year. We're expecting development from him. We're expecting him to not play AFL level at all. And I would have been more than happy for him to get a 0 and just bide his time in the VFL this year. So the 2 is just about his impact on the field. And I think, he had very little impact on the field at AFL level, did a bit at VFL level, but, I'm obviously weighting the VFL impact a lot lower. And so I think a 2 for Will Dawson is right about where it needs to be. Griffin Logue is a really tough one to mark because we know he was coming back from that knee injury from last year, made it back in round 20 for 2 games, and then unfortunately had a wrist injury that meant that he missed the last few games. I thought he was a little bit shaky on his return. I've heard some talk of people saying that he, didn't skip a beat. I personally thought he did skip a beat, but I also expected that because if you're out for more than 12 months, you're going to miss some things. I think if he just gets a good run at it next year and is injury-free, we can expect some great things from him. He had 12 disposals or averaged 12 disposals and 4.5 marks per game in the 2 games he played. Did a bit of intercepting, came back in for some tough games too. So, my expectations for him this year were similar to Will Dawson, that they were pretty low, and I think for different reasons he scores a 2. As a player, we obviously have high expectations for him, but coming off the ACL, I think we just wanted to see him get fit. Thank goodness his injury is unrelated to the ACL. You don't want to be getting an injury, but you certainly would not want a re-injury to the knee or a leg injury in that area. I think next year he'll really shore up the defence, allow Core some respite. Potentially, if we're playing Comben back again, it allows Comben an opportunity to absolutely be that intercept defender and not have to worry about necessarily playing on the second best tool. I think it's a reflection of his lack of capacity to get on the field, his score of 2, not his ability. So I think a 2 for Griff, and totally get it. Hopefully next year he can come back and have a massive impact on field. Miller Bergman was one that initially I thought was going to be tricky, but eventually I actually landed pretty quickly on his score. 3 games, 7.3 disposals per game. For a variety of reasons, be them form, fitness, injury, all those things, wasn't able to really get a game all year. Like I said, only played 3 games, and in a defence that really was crying out for a player like him. So the fact that he was only able to play 3 games is not a great look. I don't think that his form at VFL level was particularly enticing. I'm not sure if there's going to be a role for him next year. We know that Archer's definitely leapfrogged him. Josh Goder will hopefully come back from injury. Griffin Logue is going to come back. That's without even talking about someone like Riley Hardiman, who will hopefully take the next step. So I think Miller Bergman's a real watch for next year. If he can't do something serious, I think he's probably at risk of being delisted. Luke McDonald's the sort of player that's holding him out, or Darcy Tucker. But, I don't think that's going to happen based on this year, because both McDonald and Tucker, neither of them are old enough to be on the way out immediately, and I don't think at this point Miller Bergman's an upgrade on them. I'm not really sure what his defining attributes are. He's a kind of a safe kick without being incisive. He doesn't really bite off dangerous kicks, but he can reliably find a target. He's not a great one-on-one defender. He's not super quick. So, I have concerns about him. I certainly want to be wrong. I'd love it if he has a great, massive preseason and comes back and smashes it next year. I just don't see it. So, for me, I think, he played 3 games. I'm giving him a 1. I think his impact was virtually nil. Maybe it's a little harsh, but I think it was a really down year for him. I think last year we saw something that we wanted him to build on, and he went backwards this year, unfortunately. So a 1 for Miller Bergman. I think we're seeing now, this is part of the reason that we've had such a difficult year down back, is whilst we started relatively strong with a couple of 7s, there's a lot of 2s and 1s in here that just weren't able to have an impact on the field. And another one that falls into a similar category, Biggie Newen. 3 games again. We had a lot of players that played 3 games. Average 14.3 disposals a game, 4.7 spoils, 2.3 tackles, 6 marks. We know he's a relatively good mark. Showed his athletic ability, took some good intercept marks. The trouble was, whenever he had the footy, we were nervous. His disposal, extremely questionable. Decision-making, extremely questionable. I think he just probably needs to understand his role a little better and get really good at his role. I have question marks about whether he's possibly too raw to be moulded, because whilst we can say he's new to our club, he did spend 3-4 years on the Richmond list, played 1 game of footy, and there's probably a reason that they were happy to give him up for, essentially nothing. So I think, look, there's always a chance. You never know with a player with this kind of athleticism. If you can turn them into an AFL footballer, it's a great result. I just don't know if we're seeing enough to make us think that's going to happen. And, this is probably going to be his best year to show us something with our injuries and our lack of options in defence. He got a couple of games to show it, but, geez, he He loved a clanger turnover, did Biggie Newen. He was really unsure with the footy. And the problem is, if you've got an intercept defender, they're going to end up with the footy. And so he really struggled to make the right decisions with the footy. Went back into the VFL, and I don't think was necessarily fantastic back there either. So I'm giving Biggie a 2. And he, similar to Miller Bergman, is a big question mark for next year, because I do have some grave concerns about whether or not he's going to find a spot on an AFL list. And, that's okay. I'm totally okay with having a punt on someone like him, because we've got no other depth on the list that we're, sacrificing in that place. So not a slight on picking him up, but it hasn't worked out so far, and personally I don't think it's likely to work out. Charlie Comben is one that we can be a lot more positive about. 19 games, 13.4 disposals averaged, 4 spoils, 3.2 intercept marks, 6.4 marks in total. And, we're going to be positive here. Played mostly down back, but was swung forward a couple of times. We all remember that game against Carlton where he kicked 3 goals and a quarter, and we all thought, oh my God, he's here. They were the only 3 goals that he kicked all year. Which is interesting to think about. He obviously, like I said, didn't play a lot of footy in the forward half, but he did play enough that you'd probably like him to have kicked a couple more goals than that. I think the win here was just getting him through the majority of the season. Like I said, 19 games, missed the first couple and then missed 1 or 2 at the end as well. Getting him now to 28 career games. Hopefully next year we can turn that into 50 career games, and then you can expect his best footy to actually come to the fore. Playing as an intercept defender is definitely the best spot for him. We saw at times, I think we all remember that Gold Coast game where Sam Day just torched him. One-on-one, he's still learning the craft as a defender and doesn't have that positioning, doesn't necessarily know when the right time to push off is or when to go. So playing as a defender one-on-one, he really, we saw his deficiencies. But playing more as a loose intercepting defender, I think we saw, we know that that's a role that's super important in footy. Oftentimes it is failed forwards that go and play that role. I'm totally happy for him to play that role next year. By the same token, I'd also be happy to throw him forward, because long term, I personally probably see him as a forward. We know it's harder to find forwards than backs. If he could work on his capacity to kick goals, I think he could potentially make an amazing forward. And again, he's played 28 AFL games. He's a lot younger in terms of AFL experience than I think we give him credit for, because he's been on the list for a while. He was a relatively high draft pick, and he's someone that, since the early days of him being at the club, we've wanted to get time into him. So, look, I do hope that whatever position we play him in next year, he's able to get some continuity in that position. The part that makes me a little bit nervous about playing him in defence is similar to Biggie. He can sometimes bite off a little bit too much with his kicking. Probably, less frequently than Biggie did in his short time in the side. But I'd much prefer to see Chom giving the hand pass off to McKercher or kicking it down the line long than I would to see him, kicking it inside on a 45-degree angle and trying to split 2 defenders. That brought him undone a couple of times. All in all, revelation down back. I think it's easy to forget at times that he hasn't played defence at all until this year. It was kind of tossing him up between a 6 and a 7, but I think on balance, it was a 7. That he had some real standout games, and I think was better than average, even though when he was, found himself out one-on-one, he was vulnerable. I think the good things that he did outweigh the negative things, and, like I said, a super positive year for Chom, and the fact that we were able to find a defender down there in a year where we really had very little options was fantastic. So a 7 for the big Chom. Josh Goder I'm going to talk about very quickly. Just the one game, and in that game we know against GWS his Achilles snapped, and that was the end of his year. Super unfortunate, but as a result, zero impact on the AFL or on the ground in general. I'm giving Josh a 0. No slight on him. I feel super bad for him, and it was really disappointing because we thought after his pre-season it was super promising. He was bound for a big year, and potentially it was going to be the year that he stamps himself as an AFL footballer. Hopefully that can be next year. He can get back to 100%. The only benefit of doing a season-ending injury that early is that you've got a full 12 months to get ready for the next year. I don't imagine that his pre-season will be that interrupted, and so hopefully we'll be able to get him into the side next year, because he's a super exciting player. He's got some great kicking off half-back, pretty quick, can also play on the wing. I'm high on Josh Goda, but I do worry about, what an Achilles injury can do to a player like him. So tentatively high on him for next year, but unfortunately a 0. Similar story here with Braden George. Some solid performances at VFL level, but unfortunately went down early with the injury, and that ruined any progress that he had. I think I'm giving him a 1, and I'm going to justify that by at least he was able to play some VFL footy and show some potential at that level. He wasn't able to get into the AFL side and make a debut, but I think we saw that the talent's there with him at VFL level. We know that it's there. It's just whether or not he's able to get his body right and stay fit. So the 1 is just a reflection of the fact that he wasn't able to get in the park. I really do hope that he's able to turn it around. But look, I don't want to jinx anything. I don't want to be negative, but it is rare. There are cases for it, but it is rare that a player of Braden George's, injury history is not dramatically impacted by that. Look, I think of someone like Braden George is who I'm talking about. I think of someone like Dan Menzel, who mostly played at Geelong, had some fantastic impact, but once he was impacted by those injuries, we didn't see the same player. And I do worry that could happen with Braden George. He's had so many injuries at a young age. So, look, he's just a watch for me. I would love to be wrong. We saw some great footy at VFL from him, but yeah, the injuries worry me. A 1 for Braden George. 2 left. Jackson Archer is, an easy one to be positive about. 15 games, 10 disposals per game, 3.3 marks, 2.5 tackles. He's now only up to 23 career games. So between him and Chom, they've got 51 games, which is crazy to think about. And look, we know that his stats aren't going to reflect the impact that he has on games of footy. He polled in the North Podium on 4 occasions, but was super consistent once he came into the side. We saw he was able to crack the top 10 in the Sid Barker on the back of only 15 games, which is quite remarkable. We know that he had that one really poor game against Bobby Hill where Bobby, I think, kicked 5 or 6 on him and really put him to the sword, but he came back, bounced back the next game and had a fantastic day. Blanketed Bailey Fritsch at one point, played really well on the Geelong smalls, just showed that flexibility. I definitely think that playing on those mediums and smalls is his wheelhouse. If for whatever reason you really need him to play as the third tall, and he can sort of do that so long as it's more of an intercepting role, but that's not the preference. That's more of a desperation thing. I think we saw him a couple of times kind of play that Chom role and intercept, and his ferocious attack on the footy in the air is fantastic. He has a fantastic ability to mark the ball at his highest point and not give opposition players the opportunity to get a fist in there or mark it themselves. So yeah, he had a remarkable year. He's certainly played a lot better than I was expecting that he could be. His disposal by foot is on the improve. It's definitely not a key part of his game yet, but I think he's probably a little bit less of a liability in that area than he has been in his first couple of years. And yeah, I think just a massive improver. I would say one of our first picks now, particularly in defence, because he has that absolute lockdown and just will not or refuses to be beaten kind of attitude about him that you really love in a defender. I think it's a 7. It could have been an 8, and I think it would have been an 8 if he'd played a little bit more of the season and had played at the start. But I think with the 15 games, it's pretty hard for me to give him more than a 7 because I'm talking about impact on the AFL season. But a massive improver. I gave him a 3 last year, and that was based on not playing a lot of footy. I think a 7 is a massive win for him. And like I said, if he'd played, he played 15, if he was able to play 18 or 19 at that level, I think he'd probably be an 8 and therefore our highest marked defender because, he was sensational defensively. His tackling is ferocious. He's just got that Glenn Archer in him. Like, he's his father's son, absolutely. And I think it's so great that we've found one, so to speak, albeit he's a father's son and we kind of knew he had it in him, but wouldn't be many outside of the club that saw this kind of season from Jackson Archer happening. I think it'd be pretty rare. And the final player to review is Callan Dawson. So 11 games for him, 10.2 disposals averaged, 4 spoils, 3.4 marks. I think the fact that he was able to play nearly half the year is great, but I don't think he was able to lock down a position in the side. Kicked his first AFL career goal, which was a highlight, a massive kick from 50 on the run, which was a sight to behold. We love that. Missed a big chunk of footy in the middle of the year, and was at times experimented with playing on the smaller players. I don't really know why we were doing that. He's 196 centimetres. And sure, he's quick, but he's not necessarily agile. He doesn't necessarily have the evasiveness to keep up with those smaller players. So he did get torched a couple of times playing on the smalls. I think you can play him on the mediums, no doubt, and you can play him on a second or a third tall, but got found out on the smalls, and when he was forced to play on the number one opposition tall. Similar to a few of our players, I think this might have been his best opportunity to kind of cement a role with Griffin Logue out. So it's going to be interesting next year. He's still contracted, so he's going to be on the list, but I don't know where he kind of fits next year with Logue coming back. For me, he's certainly behind someone like Aidan Corr in the pecking order, and then it becomes, is Chom playing down back? Because if you're playing Chom and Logue and Corr, I don't think there's any room for Callan Dawson. Potentially, that's why we're trying to see if he could play on the smaller players. But look, he's got some fairly good run and carry. He can kick the footy. It's not shy of disposing of it, but it's probably not, an absolute strength of his. He's got more of a penetrating kick than necessarily a super accurate or incisive one. I think for his score, for me, in terms of an AFL player, he had a below average year, but not dramatically so. So I think it's a 4 for Callan Dawson. He was okay. But disappointing at times, and only the 11 games says to me that he wasn't quite able to solidify that spot. So I think a 4 is right on. Would have liked to see him play a little bit more, and would have liked to see him play a little bit more consistently. So slightly below average. Am concerned about him long term, and I think the thing about him is he's not young. He's 26. So he's young in terms of AFL experience for sure, but it's not like he's 20 years old and we're still waiting for him to fill out and, find himself at the level. He's now had 2.5 years on an AFL list. I think that's enough time to kind of ground yourself and figure out whether or not you can turn it around. Next year is the year that we'll find out, I guess, because that's his last contracted year currently. And I hope that he can find it. There's every chance that he does find a role, but I do think there's going to be a logjam of players in that area, and he's just another one that's kind of not quite good enough, probably. And a reflection of where our list is at. So that is everyone. I'll just go through them now and see that I'm happy with them. Maybe we'll go bottom to top. So at the bottom, Josh Goder a 0, no question marks there. A 1 for George and for Bergman, 0 impact and virtually no impact. So I think those are fair. A 2, Will Dawson, but we're optimistic. Griffin Logue, more of an injury thing, and Biggie Newen, a bit of I just don't think he's got it, but a 2 for those players. Riley Hardiman, an optimistic 3, similar to Will Dawson. I think next year we can have slightly higher expectations. Callan Dawson and Zach Fisher are 4s, but more on the disappointing side. I would have liked to see better seasons from both of them. Fisher in particular, just based on the fact that he's coming in on a nice contract and, hopefully coming across to, add to our list. And I think he was only okay and disappointing in elements. Tucker and McDonald got 5s. They had average years. Not bad, not good, just there, and mostly played their role. And then the players in our defence that I thought were above average that had, good to nearly great years, Aidan Corr, Colby McKercher, Charlie Comben and Jackson Archer all on 7. It'll be interesting to see when I rate the other areas of the ground, which I haven't done yet. So it's not even as though I've done it, but I haven't recorded. I haven't thought about it too much yet. Whether or not most of the players are sitting in those same areas, I guess it'll be interesting to have a look at, each area of the ground when it's complete and just see. I guess you could sort of average out a score for that area of the ground. We might do that at the end, but yeah, just interesting to think about. So Corr, McKercher, Comben and Archer, our best performers in defence. Tucker and McDonald after them. Dawson, Fisher, Hardiman, Will Dawson, Logue, Biggie, George, Bergman, and Goater down the bottom with his unfortunate injury. That is going to do it. Please hit me up on social media or give us a comment on Spotify if you have any thoughts on how I've rated each of those players. Like I said off the top, I tried to be as objective as possible, but it is subjective at the end of the day. It is my opinion on their seasons, and so I am totally happy for you to disagree. I'm sure there'll be some people that want to score Luke McDonald lower than that, and that is your prerogative. Next week or next podcast focused on the AFL men's side, we'll look at the midfielders in the middle part of the ground. There will be a podcast in between then and now as we look at round 4 for the AFLW, so you can look out for that. And other than that, I will bid you farewell. I hope that everything is going well for you. For me, I am about to head into the school holidays, which is a vibe for me. I'm looking forward to having a bit more time to think about the podcast, to be honest, because I'm busy with my day job. And let's go North Melbourne, go the AFLW side, tune into that on the weekend, and I will speak to you soon. Go North. Thanks for listening to another episode of North Pod. If you give me a rating or review on your podcast service, that would be much appreciated. And please follow me on all social media at North Pod Show. I'm on X or Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and I'm also very active on the North Melbourne subreddit. Hope you'll join me for the next episode.